Hello and welcome to our chapter on family life. I love this cartoon of the parent and the teenager. I think it works very, very well. Now, in your textbook, at the end of the chapter, they talk about some changes in family overall over the last few hundred years that are significant. I'm going to do this at the very beginning because I'll probably refer to it throughout this lecture. Now, the textbook points out there's three specific changes that have occurred over the course of the last 2 centuries that still have an absolutely direct effect on family today. And I agree with the textbook. I talk about at least two of these, probably in every single course I teach, and the fact that they affect everything about family life and about our society in general. Now, you might not think that they're very significant because depending on your age, you're used to them. And these are not really changes for us. They're just the way that things are. So if you can try to think about these three things in the opposite way, it will help you understand the effect that they had. Because these changes really have directly affected patterns of family life. First is a lower birth rate. In my classes, I will often talk about the effect a lower birth rate has had, and with that, access to safe, reliable, and effective birth control for women. Well, your text makes the point that in 1800, women in the US gave birth to an average of 8 children in their lifetime. And for example, I can show you that in Canada in 1851, it was about 7 children per woman. That's on average, which means a lot of women gave birth to a lot more children. What this means is if you were a woman in Canada at this time, you could be pretty much guaranteed that from about age 25 to 35, you would either be pregnant or you would have a newborn for 10 years straight at least. And this was the norm for several reasons. There was a very high infant mortality rate and child mortality rate. And because large families were needed to maintain a family, economically speaking, and because of religion, it was your religious duty. Because families were so large, what would that mean for you as an adolescent? It means that in many ways your life would be similar to that of an adolescent in a traditional culture. So having a lower birth rate directly affected patterns of family life, including the experience of adolescence. We now have a longer life expectancy, much longer. And I mean, think about it. If you knew that your life expectancy was only 45 years, how would that affect you as a young person? What you typically expected out of life and when you expected it. You would be initiating adulthood much earlier. You would be getting married and having children much earlier. You'd be working much earlier. Well, up until about 1900, the average life expectancy was around 45. Now, our average life expectancy is in the mid-70s, so this is also going to directly affect normal patterns of family life. And urbanization. I talk about this often in my courses. This massive, colossal shift when the majority of the population of all of North America lived in a rural farming environment to living in a much denser populated urban environment. This affected every part of family life we could possibly imagine. Imagine being an adolescent living on a farm in a rural area with no electricity, no transportation, and you don't attend school on a daily basis. Every minute of every day is spent with family, and that's it. So the picture on the left actually is a picture of Danforth Road in 1870. Your entire life would be focused on farm work and spent almost entirely with your family. So when urbanization occurred, just imagine the difference that made in daily life and in life overall. So it also meant that family as a social institution shifted to be the provider of emotional or affective functions, which means providing members with love, nurturing, and affection. Now, we've had more recent changes that have directly affected patterns of family life and thus adolescence. In North America, we have a very high divorce rate. Now, depending on how young you are, you may just think this is the norm because you've never lived in a world where it's been any different. So you don't recognize how much it's climbed, but it has indeed climbed. Just to give you an idea, I graduated high school in 1989, and no, that was not that long ago. I knew two people whose parents were not married. That's it in my entire high school. Now, of course, it's much, much different. And this means that young people experience clearly their parents going through a divorce. They're likely to experience a parent dating, probably experience what it's like to be part of a step family, whether their parent legally remarries or lives common law with somebody. There's also been a big jump, a huge jump in the number of children born outside of marriage in North America. And again, that's completely the norm. But in the past, it wasn't. In the 1950s, if you were an unmarried pregnant teen, you'd probably be sent to an unwed mother home out of town. You would give your child up for adoption, whether you wanted to or not. You didn't have a choice. And when you went back home afterward, you'd be forced to lie about where you were and never tell anybody. So this is a huge difference. There's been a big jump in dual earner families, with both the mom and the dad working full time, including after children were born. Statistically speaking, if you grow up with your mom at home full time, not working outside the home, that means you had an abnormal childhood. And abnormal means different from the norm. So you really did have an abnormal childhood. Now, if we kind of take all these changes and just keep them in the back of your mind, at the beginning of the chapter, the author makes the point that your family can be the source of your deepest attachments, where you develop into your own person and are shaped into the person you're meant to be. But family can also be a source of really bitter and painful conflict with people you often feel you cannot stand. And once you are an adult and don't live with them, maybe you rarely see or speak to them at all. And we often joke that we wish we could choose who our family was, or at least we wish we could make a few of our family members disappear for a while. If I said to you that as you grow up from childhood to adolescence and the teen years to becoming an adult, that frequent adjustments are required in this relationship, you'd all agree with this very polite way of stating the obvious. It's a very sanitized, polite way of saying, isn't it? Adjustments on your part, adjustments by your parents, adjustments by your siblings. And of course, this word adjustment does mean just that things shift or evolve. But it could also mean very, very real and emotional conflict that results in something shifting and changing. And this sounds like such a smooth process, like such a simple thing to happen. And for decades and decades, this is exactly what you saw on TV. Maybe you remember some of these TV shows, even on reruns these days, you'll probably find them. But these adjustments that occur do not always proceed smoothly and easily. Instead, it's very, very common for very real conflict to occur. And in some families, there seems to be a constant level of conflict and chaos, particularly during the teenage years. In others, there seems to be almost none. So there really is no absolute standard experience during adolescence with your family that we would call a normal experience, with everything that that term normal implies. Now, when there is a lot of conflict in family, sometimes it really can seem downright intolerable. Why? Well, again, to put it in a very simplified manner, because the young person has one idea of the way things should be as they grow up, and their parents have a different perception of the most desirable way things should be as they grow up. Their parents have a different idea of the pace they should grow up at. Again, a very nice, calm way of phrasing it. In other words, the adolescent wants to be treated like they're older, like they're not a little kid anymore. Sometimes rightly so, sometimes not. And not allowing them the independence they want when they want it at the rate they want it is the source of the conflict. Now, we know that families are much smaller now than they ever have been historically speaking. So you would think that this would mean there'd be less conflict, that families would be less complex. But in our society, relationships are not as simple as they used to be. So, because of the high divorce rate and because so many children are born outside of a marital relationship, maybe your parents were never married and lived together, or were in divorce, and perhaps both of them remarry or cohabit with somebody, which means you now have two sets of parents to contend with: your birth parents and step parents, step siblings, half siblings, and this requires a lot of adjustment. And I want to be clear here, it isn't just difficult because the adolescent thinks it is from their perspective. These family structures often are, in fact, difficult from every perspective, and they're not overreacting. So, an adolescent's family relationships these days can be really diverse, really complex, which adds a whole other layer to how families operate. And but in spite of all this, in spite of all the potential for complications and conflict and fighting that can occur, most young people still say that their family are important to them. They're an important source of support. Remember in the last chapter, I made the point, and your textbook made the point, that we have this stereotype that during adolescence, the importance of a parent just fades into the background. But this isn't quite true. In research, adolescents overwhelmingly still report their core moral values come from their parents and that they admire their parents. Are the people the majority of adolescents say they admire the most their parents? Maybe yes, maybe no, but they still rely on them for support and they admire them quite a bit. So why is this? And why is it that as you head towards emerging adulthood, for many adolescents, parents are the people to whom they have the closest attachment? Well, it isn't that your relationship with your parents becomes problem-free when you get past adolescence or going into the emerging adult stage. But at that point, you're through the majority of the adolescent angst, and you as the adolescent have matured a lot, and a lot of the issues that previously caused problems between you and your parents have simply settled down because you're older. And in addition, as you go into emerging adulthood, you're beginning to think in a way more similar to how your parents think. So your attitudes and perspectives and understandings of things are essentially more similar to your parents. Now, to understand an adolescent's family relationships, to understand how various parts of the family function as a system, we can use the family systems approach to help us with this. And what this says is that to understand how a family functions, it's really important to understand that every relationship within a family influences the family as a whole. So let's say you have a family with one child. That means you have a family between the mom and the adolescent, sorry, a relationship between mom and the adolescent, a relationship between dad and the adolescent, a relationship between mom and dad, and then you could even put in a fourth line here and say you have a relationship between mom and dad together and the adolescent. So you have all these individual relationships, and a shift or a change or a problem in any one of these relationships is going to affect how the family as a whole functions. What's going on with one person may directly affect everybody else. And every family system, no matter the exact composition of the family, is composed of a variety of these subsystems or sub-relationships. So in a family with more than one child, or with extended family members who are closely involved with the family system becomes quite a bit more complex, each consisting of dyadic relationships, so a relationship of two persons, as well as every possible combination of three or more persons. So the family systems approach is based on two key principles. And one is that every subsystem or every relationship influences every other subsystem or every other relationship in the family. So if you have a really high level of conflict between the parents, it's not only going to affect the relationship between them, but also the relationship that every that each of them has with each of their children, and potentially the relationship between each of the children. A high level of conflict between two siblings will not only affect them, but also any other siblings in the family as well as the parents. So each subsystem affects the family as a whole. And in addition, a second related principle is that a change in any family member or family subsystem results in a period of disequilibrium. So in other words, when there's a change, things are going to be off balance for a little bit until the family as a whole adjusts. So yes, if any family member is having a particularly difficult time in some way, that will affect them as an individual, obviously, but it's also affecting them as a member of their family, which may in turn cause disequilibrium in the family. Now, it could also be something really positive taking place. It doesn't necessarily have to be something very negative. So, for example, somebody changing to a better school, or somebody making it onto a team or something like that, that's going to cause a disequilibrium, even though it's something positive, a positive development. If mom or dad is unemployed or underemployed and they find work, which is positive, well, that's going to have an effect, even though the development is positive. Now, remember, it isn't just a young person who's going through changes while the young person is in adolescence that affects the family system. Parents change and develop as well at the same time. So, for example, if toward the end of middle age, when a woman goes through menopause, this causes real physical symptoms: weight gain, difficulty sleeping, sometimes headaches, being very, very tired, kind of like the stereotypical midlife things that both men and women sometimes experience when on some level they evaluate what they have or have not done in their life. Well, this is going to affect the adolescent as well. So remember, it's not just always the adolescent affecting the family structure. It could also be the parent affecting the family structure that then has an effect on the adolescent. Now, even if a change is expected and typical and normal, which is why they're called normative changes, they're expected, you know they're going to happen. There's nothing unusual about them at all. That's still going to affect the family as a system. So even though these are normative changes, they're going to affect the equilibrium of the family. Of course, then we also have less normative changes that may occur. As I've already said, divorce, custodial issues, financial issues, step-family relationships. These are also going to cause a disequilibrium. There may be less normative changes in a family in terms of psychological issues for the adolescent or one of their parents, depression or anxiety or addiction. There may be the unexpected early death of one parent or a child in the family. You just never know what life is going to throw at you or when these things will happen. An accident is called just that because it's unexpected and unintentional. Whether changes that occur are generally expected and thus normative, or not expected and thus less normative, adjustments in the family system are required to restore a new equilibrium. And we're going to look at 3 aspects of the family system that have implications specifically for an adolescent's development: changes in their parents at midlife, sibling relationships, and extended family relationships.